JLC Live Connect. I'm Gary Striegler, and today I'm going to be talking about sanding. So the name of this presentation is Sanding Tips of a Perfect Finish. Of course, it always makes me nervous when I say a perfect finish because there's nothing that's perfect in woodworking. But I'm going to try and share with you as much as I can of all the things I've learned in my almost 50 years of being a trim carpenter, cabinet builder, and sometimes furniture maker. I am the owner of Craftsman Builders in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but what I really like to do is actually get out there and do the work myself. So I'm going to start out by sharing with you the description of the 4 types of sanding equipment that I use when I'm working. And I'm going to go over each one of those a little bit, and then I'm going to go to the second part of the sanding equation, which is the actual abrasive, the sandpaper, if you will, that does the actual work. So first of all, I want to start out by talking about these 4 different types of sanders. Now, the first sander that I ever used was a lot similar to this. It's a belt sander, and this is the most aggressive of the sanding equipment that I would use. This particular one is a 3x21 belt sander. 3x24s are fairly common also, and you can even have 4x24s. And there's some smaller ones too, but this is probably the most common size. If you were to go to one of the big box stores, this is probably the sander you'd see in almost every one of them. Now, this can also be a kind of scary tool. Some people are actually afraid to use a belt sander because it does remove a lot of material. It's a real workhorse, but you can also make a really big mess really fast with a belt sander. So later on, when we get going into the practical sanding tips part of this presentation, I'm going to share some things you do and don't want to do to make sure that you get great results and not make a big mess. So the second type of sander, what I'm doing is I'm kind of going from the most aggressive to the least aggressive. The second type that I would use is a random orbit sander. And this is a great example of a random orbit sander. Here's a cordless random orbit sander. And what random orbit means is it's the head that's doing the sanding is spinning, but it also has this oscillating movement. Now, the reason that they do that is to try to conceal scratches. And we'll get in a lot more into scratches later as we talk about how we select sandpaper and which sander that we're going to use. But these are really good sanders. They're probably the most widely used sanders that there are. Now, interestingly enough, they've only been around for maybe 25 years, something like that. I'm trying to remember the first time I saw one. But anyway, these are great sanders. Now, the next one that I would go over, this is literally just an orbital sander. This takes off less material than a random orbit, and it's simply going around in a circle. And these are used, primarily for your very finishing stages of sanding. The second sander that I ever bought was a much bigger version of this, and they call them finishing sanders sometimes. But so this takes off less material than a random orbit sander, and it just goes around in circles. It doesn't have that orbiting action. Now, the final one, and this is one that I don't use as much, but this is a little kind of a detail sander. It's got this triangular pad, and the benefit of that triangular pad is you can get into a corner where you can't maybe get into a corner with something, really any of these other tools. Now this though has a very small motion, so it doesn't take off very much material at all. Now, one of the other things that I just want to cover talking about all these sanders, which is very important today, is dust collection, or how they contain the dust. Now, probably the very most effective way to do that is a tool like this, where you can hook a vacuum up to it, and you're going to collect a great deal of the dust that way. Another interesting thing that I've learned, the sandpaper with this tool lasts a lot longer because all the dust is being pulled out and it's not kind of accumulating. So this belt sander is an example of something that collects in a bag. If I had to guess, I'd say you're going to get maybe 60%, something like that, of the dust in this bag. This sander also collects in a bag, and it does a pretty decent job, but you're certainly going to get a lot more dust in the air than you would with a vacuum hooked up to it. And I think you could actually take this bag off and hook a vacuum up to this. And same thing here, there's a little hose there you could hook a vacuum up to it. So it kind of depends on where you're working. If you're like working in someone's house, boy, you probably want to get the best dust collection you can. That means hooking a vacuum up. And a lot of these vacuums now are hooked up where you turn the trigger on, it's going to turn the vacuum on. They can be really, really effective. So that's generally the 4 types of sanders that I work with. Now let's talk a little bit about the second part of the equation, and that is the actual sandpaper. So when you go to even the box store, you're going to see all kinds of different options for sandpaper. Generally speaking, well, one, the more you pay for the sandpaper, probably the better it's going to work. And every sandpaper, whether it be a belt for a sander belt or a random orbit disc or a sheet of paper, is going to have a number that's the grit. So the thing that you want to think about is the lower the grit, the more coarse the abrasive, and the faster it's going to cut. And as you get up into higher numbers, you're going to have a lot finer sanding pattern. So then there's also a couple of other different things, like some of the sandpaper literally is paper. It's the abrasive is attached to a piece of paper, and then there's some where it's actually attached to cloth. Generally, anything that's attached to cloth is going to be more expensive, but it's probably going to be more durable also. Now, for things like this belt sander, all sander belts, as far as I know, are going to be attached to a cloth, and that's because, you know, what you ask a belt sander to do, which is go around and around at high rate of speed, is really, really demanding. I have seen some discs that are paper, and I've seen some that are cloth backed. Now, that brings me to another question or thing. So this disc is hook and loop, which means it's held on by Velcro, and that does a good job. There are also some discs, although I don't use near as many of them as I used to, that's called PSA, or pressure sensitive adhesive. And on that you have a smooth pad, and you glue or stick the sandpaper onto that pad, sand until it's pretty much worn out, and then you lift that piece off and replace it with a new one. I think one of the reasons that the hook and loop is getting more popular, for instance, if I was sanding and I wanted to sand first with 100 grit, and then I wanted to change to 120 or something, all I do is just take this off, lay that aside, put the other disc on, and I'm back sanding. So one of the other things that you need to know as you're thinking about sandpaper, as you can see, this disc has a hole pattern in it that matches up with the pad on this sander. Another important thing too, these do tend to wear out a little bit. The hook and loop part does wear out, but they can always be replaced. But you have to make sure that the sandpaper that you have matches the hole pattern in the pad so that that dust collection can actually take place. So one of the other things that I would want to share as we think about sanding, you know, a great deal of the time when I'm sanding something, it involves sanding a joint that's been glued. And so anytime that you do that, sanding creates heat, and a glue joint, basically that glue that you're trying to get off there can kind of become sticky or gummy. So you want to try to have as little glue left when you start sanding as possible, because it'll gum up your paper. Now, there's two things I want to show you about that. You know, the first one is you can get a glue scraper, and on any flat surface like this, you can remove, here's another one too, you can remove a lot of the glue before you start doing any sanding. One of the things that I'll do too, if I'm gluing something up and it's to where I can get at it, I'll literally just wipe the excess off and kind of flatten it down, and that makes it to where there's a lot less to gum up the paper. Now, if you are using like especially the belt sander, and you start that sander, you start getting kind of gum on it. This has got a little bit of material building up on it. You can take one of these soft sanding sticks and you run the sander and hold that against it, and it will to some degree clean that back up. It won't clean it up the whole way, but it will make it a lot better. So that is a good general overview of the types of sanders that I use. And again, the second part of it, which is the abrasive or the paper that actually does the work. Now, I'm going to move some of this stuff back out of the way, and we'll come back and we're going to talk about how do I decide which one of these I want to use and what grit of sandpaper and such do I need to use. And that's basically going to come down to two things. We'll review that in a second, but it is, am I sanding for something that's going to be painted or stained, and what type of material am I going to sand? Let me move a few